Finally, we just ask that you take a couple minutes to fill out a very, very short questionnaire at the end of the hour. The topic we're looking at today is broad and may lend itself to follow-up webinars, and would appreciate your thoughts on that. So thanks very much, and I'm going to pass this off to Jim Lazar.
Well, good morning or afternoon, depending upon where you are. As Dave mentioned, I'm a RAP senior advisor. For over 30 years, I was a consultant in cost allocation, rate design, and utility resource planning, and appeared before, I think, roughly half of the state regulatory commissions during that role. So I've got a pretty strong geographic background in the U.S. I've also worked overseas for RAP in about 15 countries. So I've got a little bit of a picture of the world. RAP has published a number of papers on rate design. These ones in small type are ones that we did in previous years. In the last couple of years, we did a global best practices series, and there were 2 in that series on rate design. The first was time varying and dynamic rate design that was published in 2011. And the topic of today's presentation is a companion to that, rate design where advanced metering infrastructure has not been fully deployed. Most utilities, even those that have installed smart meters, haven't got the computer systems up and running to actually use the full capabilities of those yet, and are at this point still limited to relatively simple rate design. And so that's the focus of today's paper. And we'll go up to, but not across the line of things that actually require advanced metering infrastructure. But rate design isn't really very complicated. I think most of you have seen and can understand this rate design. 10-year-olds can figure it out. And it gives us a very simple message. And I think it's important to keep in mind that rate design doesn't have I do want to start with some very basic rate design terms and the spectrum of people on the call today. Will recur during this presentation: customer charge, which is sometimes also called a basic charge, a standing charge, a meter charge, a service charge, a fixed charge, a monthly charge that applies independent of consumption. The energy charge is the price per kilowatt hour. It may be in more than one time period. It may be in more than one block of usage, but it's always measuring the kilowatt hours. And third is the demand charge, which is a monthly fee based on the highest instantaneous usage rate. And instantaneous is most commonly measured for over a period of an hour, not a second. Sometimes a 15-minute interval is used, but it's the highest instantaneous usage rate during the month, or in some cases during the year. So you'll see those terms come up again and again. I think you'll all understand them when they come up. I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about residential rate design types, from simple to more complex. A flat rate, a uniform rate per kilowatt hour for all usage, an inclining block rate where you have 2 or more blocks of usage and where incremental usage is priced at a higher price than baseline or initial usage. TOU, or time of use rates, where you have 2 or more time of use periods, typically with higher prices during higher cost periods. And then combination of a TOU and inclining block rate. So a TOU rate that includes a lower price for lower levels of usage. There are other rate designs that are very commonly discussed these days: critical peak pricing and real-time pricing. Those are the domain of the companion publication to this on time varying and dynamic rate design, and I will refer you to that publication for discussions of those. I will use those terms a little bit, but they're not the subject of today's webinar. The current trend we're seeing around the U.S. is utilities seeking higher customer charges. I've put here on the screen the 9 largest U.S. utilities and what their current customer charges are. These utilities serve 1 out of 6 Americans, so they are indeed very, very large utilities. As you can see, they range from Pacific Gas and Electric with no customer charge at all up to Con Ed at over $15. It's quite a range. San Diego Gas and Electric has just proposed to the California PUC that they would like to implement a $38 customer charge, enough to cover all of their distribution costs. I think it's unlikely to go very far, but that's an indicator of what some utilities are seeking today. So what's wrong with high customer charges? It's clear what's right. They stabilize utility revenues independent of usage. But what's wrong is a fairly long list. First of all, few costs are really fixed. Technically, in accounting terms, only interest and depreciation are fixed costs. Everything else, the return on equity, the income taxes, all labor costs are technically variable costs. A high customer charge, given any given utility revenue requirement, reduces the per kilowatt hour rate, and that encourages consumption, and we'll see that effect here in just a moment. A high customer charge is punitive to apartment dwellers and urban residents, people who are concentrated and for whom the utility has relatively low distribution costs per customer. By treating all customers the same, rural customers, suburban customers, McMansions with very large electrical systems, and studio apartments with very small electrical systems. And there are other options for revenue stability available to deal with utility concerns about revenue stability if they're significant, including revenue decoupling, which RAP has published quite a few things on. As we look around the world, globally, the most common residential rate design we found was the inclining block rate. Almost universal on the West Coast, and actually in the western states now, very common in New England, and sporadic in the rest of the country, but around the world, by far, the dominant rate form. Most of these have 0 customer charge or very low customer charges. But these inclining block rate designs were put together with a huge variety of goals, of regulatory goals. Some of them are cost-based, allocation of limited low-cost resources and recognition that load factor declines as usage increases. That is to say, large customers are peakier than small users, and that's mostly because those large users have end uses that coincide with the system peak that small users don't. Policy goals such as encouragement of energy conservation are providing all customers with some essential needs level of electricity at an affordable cost, and in some cases explicitly to benefit low-income customers. And the science is pretty clear. About 70% of low-income customers use less than the system median consumption. So an inclining block rate will benefit the majority, but not all, of low-income customers. So I have to start with a few numbers. I'm going to try and keep the numbers out of this presentation to some extent, but this one's really pretty critical. This is the bill frequency analysis for a small municipal utility of about 45,000 residential customers. These are the bills for the entire year grouped into usage levels. 154,000 of the bills through the year were for less than 250 kilowatt hours. Another 176,000 were from 250 to 500 kilowatt hours. That's about 2/3 of the bills were for under 500 kilowatt hours. But now if we go to the column where I show the percentage of the sales on the system that are made to customers using more than the amount on that block, we see that 92% of the kilowatt hours went to customers whose bills were for more than 250. And 69% of the kilowatt hours went to customers whose bills were for more than 500. This is a summer peaking utility. In the summer, those numbers would be larger. In the winter, they'd be a little smaller. So figure in the summertime, about 80% of the sales are made to the customers whose usage is above 500 kilowatt hours, and an inclining block rate at 500 would affect about 80% of the sales in summer. That is, the customers using 80% of the power would see that second block as their marginal cost on which they would decide whether to consume more power or less power. So we can then take that that data and an elasticity factor and look at the effect on usage of alternative rate design. So using that sample utility, I designed first a flat rate of 15 cents a kilowatt hour, then an inclining block rate where I set the usage over 250 at 1.5 times the usage under 250, and found that that would be expected to reduce usage by about 2.6%, based on a relatively conservative and low elasticity factor of 0.2. Then I took that same utility and designed a high customer charge, $25 a month customer charge. That collected a lot of the revenue, and so the price per kilowatt hour came down to about a dime. And responding to the change between a 15-cent flat rate and a 10-cent flat rate with a high customer charge, that rate design was expected to increase usage by about 6.3%. So the difference between an inclining block rate and a flat rate with a high customer charge, about 9% difference in expected customer usage. That's an amount equal to about a decade of typical utility energy efficiency programs. So it's a big deal. Rate design can make a big difference. It can be as important as the utility-funded energy efficiency programs. Now, I mentioned that some of the inclining block rate designs out there are designed on a cost basis. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these today. They are detailed in the publication, which you've got a link to and is on our website. The first is a inclining block rate based on resource types. In this case, a utility with a limited amount of hydro, pricing that at a cost for the power of maybe 2 cents a kilowatt hour, adding delivery produced a rate of 8 cents, and new supply needed to serve high levels of usage, costing 10 cents, and with delivery about 16 cents. So this is one example of a cost-based inclining block rate. And another that is actually quite common around, extremely common around the world, is the inclining block rate that's based on load factor. Large users have air conditioning in summer peaking regions, space heating in winter peaking regions, and the highest levels of use tend to be the peakiest. If you took a typical commercial rate of $10 a kilowatt plus 8 cents a kilowatt hour, you might well develop a cost-based inclining block rate that went from 10 cents for the initial usage for lights and appliances up to 15 cents a kilowatt hour when you get into the space conditioning block of usage. And we see these in a lot of places. I'll start with just a couple of examples. California is probably the most noteworthy for this. I've got Palo Alto, Pacific Gas and Electric, and Southern Cal Edison here. PG&E and SCE are a couple of the nation's largest utilities. Palo Alto is a small municipal utility. Almost all of the California utilities, public and private, have steeply inclining block rates with low customer charges. The thing that's unique in California is the baseline concept. Every customer has a individual baseline based upon their housing type and climate zone. They tend to run from 270 kilowatt hours a month to up as high as 1,200 in the mountain regions. And then the rate design is a function of that baseline. So if you go to the PTA meeting and compare your bill with your neighbor's bill, they may not look very similar. It's a complexity, but given that these utilities serve, about 10 million customers apiece, having a single rate system-wide was deemed to be inequitable by the California PUC. But the key thing is that there's the tail blocks tend to be very much higher than the initial blocks. The CPUC is examining possible changes there. I wanted to put in a few examples from other countries. I chose China, India, because they're the most populous. Both of those countries have essentially universally inclining block rates with zero or no customer charge. That's about 30% of the world's population there. Mexico, the largest utility in North America, has a tail block that's 4 times the
Jim, we're not hearing you. I think you're going to have to switch to your backup audio, please. Sorry about that, folks. Please bear with us just a moment. We'll have Jim dial back in. So we should have Jim back momentarily.
Am I back live?
Jim, I think we have you back.
Am I there?
You are. We're getting a slight echo, but we are hearing you. Please check your go-to panel and make sure it knows that you're dialing in by telephone and not mic and speakers.
Am I audible now?
Much better. Thanks for your patience, everyone.
Okay. I apologize for that and hope that this can work for the ballot. So I just finished talking about examples from other countries. Hungary has a nearly flat rate design, but at over 20 cents a kilowatt hour, it certainly sends a conservation signal equal to those among the utilities with steep inclining block rates. I'm going to move up the chain a little bit to seasonal rates. They could be summer peaking or winter peaking, simply with a rate per kilowatt hour that's higher in whatever the peak season is. I've shown one here for Wisconsin, a summer peaking rate, one for Newfoundland, a winter peaking rate. Most of the U.S. is summer peaking. These can easily be implemented with kilowatt hour only meters. Utilities typically have to prorate a bill at the seasonal changeover time because not every customer will be read on the last day of the month when the season changes over, but utilities are pretty good at handling the prorating. But what's important is that an inclining block rate can be a seasonal rate design. You can design an inclining block rate so that most customers see the second block only in the peak season. And here is a very typical sort of a median customer for our sample utility with their monthly usage. And you see that the seasonal rate, they would, for June through October, if they just had an inclining block rate, they would only see that second block in June through October. And so the inclining block rate really functions as a seasonal rate. And that's kind of important, as we'll see in a moment. Arizona Public Service is one of the number of utilities that has combined a seasonal rate with an inclining block rate. They've got a very sharp summer daytime peak driven by air conditioning. And so what they've done is they set a flat rate in winter, 9.4 cents a kilowatt hour, and an inclining block rate in the summer that's based on the load factor principle. I was actually involved in cases 20-plus years ago in Arizona when these were first adopted. And it recognizes that the very high-use customers are pretty much, when you get above 800 kilowatt hours, and it's mostly air conditioning use. And that has a very high coincidence with the system peak. The next idea up the chain is a fixed period time of use rate. A lot of utilities have introduced these. They require meters that can measure in time of use periods, but they don't require the entire advanced metering infrastructure. There are multi-register meters that can be programmed, or you can use smart meters that aren't yet connected to a full AMI system with meter data management software. You can read them individually with meter readers pretty easily. They'll display multiple registers. So Green Mountain Power has a standard rate that's a flat rate of about $11 a month and 15 cents a kilowatt hour, and an optional time of use rate. Has a higher customer charge reflecting the fact that the meters are more expensive and require more time for meter reading and billing, and then an off-peak and on-peak rate to encourage customers to concentrate their usage in the off-peak period. It's possible to incorporate, to combine the time of use rate with an inclining block rate. And I've given an example here where you have an off-peak rate of a dime, an on-peak rate of 20 cents, but then allow a credit for, in this case, the first 500 kilowatt hours of 4 cents a kilowatt hour whenever it occurs. So off-peak, you'd be seeing 6 cents up to the total use of 500. On peak, you'd be seeing 16 cents up to the total of 500, and above 500, you'd be seeing 10 and 20. There are a lot of other alternatives to high customer charges. Manitoba Hydro has a customer charge that's linked to how big the connection to the house is, how big the electrical panel is. Fort Collins has an optional residential demand charge directed at electric space heat customers. And a lot of countries, Indonesia, France, and Italy are three that I've experienced. Customers subscribe to a given demand level. So small users in apartments would subscribe to a very low level of demand and pay a very cheap subscription rate. And the big houses with lots of appliances would subscribe to a higher demand level. So a lot of ways of getting around the high customer charges. Now I'm going to get away from rate design to peak load management without AMI. This is Southern California Edison summer discount plan. They install a radio control unit on the air conditioner. Customers subscribe to either a limited number of interruptions or an unlimited number of interruptions. They choose whether they can be interrupted continuously for up to 6 hours or just cycled on and off. And they receive an annual compensation based upon the level of savings and comfort that they choose. They've got hundreds of thousands of customers on this. It provides over 1,000 megawatts of peak load reduction on their system. This is a big program that was been in place for over 20 years and does not require AMI. There are actually a lot of Midwest co-ops that require that electric water heaters be under utility control. And these are mostly coal-dependent utilities with inflexible generation. I want to talk a little bit about peak reduction versus energy reduction. Inclining block rates produce the most overall reduction in energy usage, and I showed that earlier. Time-varying prices of all kinds produce peak load reduction, but may or may not reduce total energy use. And in fact, in the time-varying rate study that was done and published by RAP, Ahmed Faruqi found that the change in total energy use was not statistically significant. So if you're looking for energy savings and controlling emissions, the inclining block rate is going to be the better choice. If you're looking for peak load reduction, the time varying price may be the better choice. And as I showed, you can actually combine them. The more complex rates work best with technology enablement, with some kind of automatic load shedding that turns off the customer's air conditioner or other major loads. This is a graphic that is in the companion publication. It is on the vertical axis how much reward the customer gets and how much peak load reduction the utility will see. On the horizontal axis, how much risk in terms of variance in price the customer experiences. And what we've been talking about is kind of on the lower end of the food chain. The other paper talks about the more advanced rate designs, and I would encourage you to look at it. But as I've described, it is possible to combine the inclining block rate, which really is a seasonal rate, and TOU rates all into one, even without moving to advanced metering. The peak demand benefits of an inclining block rate design are pretty substantial. Here I've put a time of use rate with an off-peak rate of 8 cents and an on-peak rate of 15 cents, compared to an inclining block rate with an initial block rate of 8 cents and additional usage of 15 cents. Based on our sample utility, about 80% of the usage in the peak months is by customers using over 500 kilowatt hours a month. So those customers would all see the 15-cent rate as an inclining block rate as their marginal cost. They would see exactly the same rate as the on-peak, off-peak rate. But the other 20% of the usage that's by customers who are using less would see the lower rate. This inclining block rate will achieve something close to 80% of the peak load benefits of this particular TOU rate. You will see substantial peak demand benefits from an inclining block rate if it's properly designed. Now, people ask me, what is your preferred rate design? It does require AMI. It would be something like a initial block based on the cost of older resources and high load factor usage, a second block based on the cost of new resources and low load factor usage, but it would have a critical peak surcharge applicable to a limited number of hours a year. That's sort of if you ask me what I think is the best choice. It's simple enough for people to understand, but focused on the critical peak hours that really define our generation, transmission, and distribution capacity design criteria. Our paper does talk at length about commercial and industrial rates, and I'm not going to go over those today. In the commercial sector, we've got a number of alternatives. AMI is not a barrier for larger customers. You can install advanced meters, and the meter readers can go out and what's called probe them. They just plug a laptop into them and get all the data out of them. So if you haven't got an AMI system running, that's really not a barrier for larger customers. And for industrial customers, we talk about both time of use and real-time pricing alternatives. And for both, a concept called rolling baseline rates in place in British Columbia and seems to be working well there. There are a number of other topics covered in the publication. The treatment of emission costs, pricing in restructured regions, new customer connection charges to encourage efficiency in new structures, a couple of low-income energy topics, designing of low-income energy assistance rates, and prepayment, which has been advocated and implemented even by a few utilities. It's extremely controversial and strongly resisted by low-income advocates. So I urge you to go to the publication to see those. I want to finish up with some key themes for modern rate design. First and foremost, the publication recommends that we should focus on long-run marginal costs, and including long-run marginal transmission costs, distribution costs, and environmental costs. That gets the marginal cost of serving increasing loads into the 15 and 20 cent per kilowatt hour range, and we need to be collecting prices like that if we want customers to have efficient behavior. The next is to focus on recovering costs on the usage-sensitive elements of rate design. Those are the ones that customers can respond to and will respond to. To consider some kind of dynamic price as an optional service, but don't impose complex rate design on customers who probably, small users who probably won't understand it and won't be able to respond. The flip side of that is empowering consumers to respond effectively. And there's two parts to that. One is the energy efficiency programs that enable customers to get financing for measures that will save energy. The other is technology improvements that will allow them to shed load during very high price periods if they're on a dynamic rate. And the last is that if following these principles creates utility revenue stability concerns, those should be managed separately. A revenue decoupling mechanism is probably a much better choice than a high customer charge. And I think I'm going to stop there. I'm going to just put up a slide here with the links for some of the publications I've talked about. The last one here, the customer incentives for energy efficiency through electric and natural gas rate design, is an Environmental Protection Agency publication. The other four listed here are RAC publications. You'll note that the links are the same except for the final numbers. If you jot down those numbers, you'll have an easy time finding those publications on our website. And Dave, I'm going to hand it back to you to help you sorted out some of the questions we've gotten.
Great, Jim. Thank you very much. I have a few questions. I'm just encouraging folks listening to type in other questions they may have. Jim, Anna Summer asks, why wouldn't a utility sunk costs, in other words, sunk capital investments, be considered fixed costs?
The portion of them that is fixed is the interest on the depreciation. The other costs, return and taxes, are variable. That is, we see that in a recession, the utilities' return on equity declines and the income taxes go down. They're both a function of profit. The utilities' labor costs in particular, we saw in 2008 utilities laying off thousands and thousands of employees to control their labor costs when their sales were declining. But the interest and depreciation is a fixed cost. The real question is, should fixed costs be recovered in fixed charges? And certainly in the competitive world, that's not true at all. Oil refineries have billions of dollars of fixed costs, and they recover at 1 gallon at a time. Hotels have tens of millions of dollars of fixed costs, and they recover at 1 room night at a time. Only a monopoly can impose a charge on a customer for the privilege of being a customer. When the landline telephone companies raised their fixed charges up into the $30 range, they started losing access lines like crazy, and the prepaid cellular companies that charge as little as $7 a month, have about 20% of the market today for basic telephone service, including a phone that's sitting here on my desk that costs $7 a month. So, there's two issues. What are the actual fixed costs? And the other is, should they be recovered in fixed charges? And the answer to the second question, unambiguously in the marketplace, is no. Businesses recover their fixed costs by selling the product that they have to sell.
Thank you. Jim, Eric Bryant has asked whether or not you can discuss a high customer charge combined with an inclining block rate. It looks like the Hungary example you gave, but can you discuss that?
Yeah, there are a few utilities that do that. There's one near my home that has I think it's about a $30 customer charge that's designed to capture the fact that about a third of their customers are seasonal customers, only show up in the summer months. But then the first block of power, I think it's 500 kilowatt hours, is only 1.3 cents a kilowatt hour. So once you get to 500 kilowatt hours to the usage of on that system, a pretty small use customer, there's not natural gas available in much of their service territory. That low customer charge a high customer charge has been offset by a very low first block rate. I think it's kind of a perverse rate design, but it works for that particular utility, and where a utility has a large number of seasonal customers, it may be useful. I've talked to co-ops, for example, in New Hampshire, who are very concerned about the fact that in the summertime they add a whole lot of customers, but they're, from their perspective, rich people from Boston, for whom they want to extract money, not provide economical service. And in the wintertime, they consume nothing. And for those rare circumstances where the customer mix changes a lot during the year, that kind of a rate design might work. But that high customer charge is always devouring part of the revenue requirement that could be used to move the energy charge towards the long-run marginal cost rate for production, transmission, distribution, losses, environmental costs. It's in the 15 to 20 cent a kilowatt hour range. So I think in most cases it's a bad choice. There are a few circumstances where for a utility with a very seasonal customer base it might be appropriate.
Thank you. Jim, Barb Alexander writes, Jim, I have not seen any studies that document the inclining block rates have actually shown reduced consumption compared to a flat rate. I believe an EPRI study a few years ago confirmed that inclining block rates don't actually have the impact you claim is the purpose of the rate design. Are you familiar with these studies, or do you rely on theory for promoting the notion that residential rate designs can actually impact elasticity of demand?
There are empirical studies that show they do. They've been presented to the California